Imagine a nation teetering on the edge of chaos, where every compromise only deepens the cracks in its foundation. What if I told you that the road to the American Civil War wasn't paved by a single event, but by a series of explosive moments, each one a spark in a growing inferno? From fragile agreements to violent skirmishes, courtroom bombshells to daring raids, these 5 pivotal events didn't just shape history. They revealed the soul of a divided America. Stay with us as we uncover the untold truths behind these moments and discover how they turned a nation's growing pains into an inevitable march toward war. You'll never look at history the same way again. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 is often remembered as a political solution to a growing problem, but it was far more than that. It was one of the earliest signs of the deep divisions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. At its core, this compromise was an attempt to maintain balance between free and slave states in a nation that was rapidly expanding. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and an invisible line was drawn across the Louisiana Territory at 36 degrees, 30 minutes latitude. Slavery would be prohibited north of this line, except in Missouri. On paper, this agreement seemed like a win for balance, 12 free states and 12 slave states, but beneath the surface, it was a fragile peace. The Missouri Compromise exposed just how divided the United States already was. For Southerners, any restriction on slavery represented an existential threat, not just to their economy, but to their entire way of life. Slavery wasn't merely about labor, it was about power, wealth, and maintaining a strict social hierarchy. To many Southerners, limiting slavery's expansion into new territories meant limiting their influence in Congress and their ability to protect what they saw as their rights. On the other hand, Northerners increasingly viewed slavery as incompatible with the ideals of liberty and equality that the nation claimed to uphold. For many in the North, stopping slavery's expansion wasn't just a political goal, it was a moral imperative. They believed that allowing slavery to spread into new territories would entrench an institution they saw as fundamentally unjust, making it harder to abolish in the future. What's often overlooked is how much resentment this compromise created on both sides. Southerners felt that Congress had no right to impose limits on where they could expand slavery. They believed such restrictions were unconstitutional and economically harmful. Northerners, meanwhile, felt betrayed that slavery was allowed to expand at all. This wasn't a resolution, it was merely a delay. The compromise also set a dangerous precedent by literally dividing the country into 2 distinct systems, one based on free labor and another rooted in enslaved labor. This division wasn't new. Regional differences had existed since the founding of the nation, but it had never been so explicitly drawn before. By creating this line across the Louisiana Territory, Congress essentially admitted that the United States was not one unified nation, but 2 competing societies with fundamentally different visions for America's future. The Missouri Compromise also raised questions about how new territories would be governed as America expanded westward. The United States had recently acquired vast lands through the Louisiana Purchase and Manifest Destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, was driving settlers further west. But every new territory brought with it the same question: would it allow slavery? The Missouri Compromise temporarily answered this question for some territories, but left others uncertain. This uncertainty became even more pronounced after the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, which added even more land to the United States. The compromise's fragile balance couldn't hold under the weight of these new acquisitions, and debates over whether these territories would permit slavery reignited sectional tensions. The Missouri Compromise wasn't just an early chapter in America's road to civil war. It was one of its first warning signs. It showed that while temporary agreements could delay conflict, they couldn't resolve the underlying issues dividing North and South. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, is often celebrated as a triumph of manifest destiny, fulfilling the belief that the United States was destined to expand its borders from coast to coast. However, what many don't realize is that this territorial expansion didn't unite the nation. It tore it further apart. Every new acre of land acquired from Mexico reignited the explosive question: would slavery be allowed in these territories? This conflict over expansion would become one of the most divisive issues on the road to the Civil War. When the war ended, the United States gained vast new territories, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. While this territorial gain seemed like a victory for westward expansion, it unleashed chaos in Congress. One of the earliest sparks of conflict came with the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. This proposal sought to ban slavery in all territories acquired from Mexico. Although it never passed Congress, it sent shockwaves through the South. Southerners viewed it as a direct attack on their way of life and economic system. For Northerners, however, the Wilmot Proviso represented a moral stand against slavery's spread. Many abolitionists and free soil advocates believed that allowing slavery in these new territories would entrench an institution they viewed as morally abhorrent and fundamentally incompatible with American ideals of liberty and equality. This wasn't just about land, it was about political power. Each new state had the potential to tip the balance in Congress toward free or slave states. At the time, there were 15 free states and 15 slave states, maintaining a delicate equilibrium in the Senate. The addition of even one more state on either side could shift this balance and give one region dominance over national policy. The debates over these territories also revealed deeper fears on both sides. The Mexican-American War also had unintended consequences for both regions' economies and societies. The North saw an influx of immigrants who provided cheap labor for its growing industrial base, while the South remained heavily reliant on enslaved labor for its agricultural economy. This economic divergence further deepened cultural and political divisions between the two regions. Another critical factor was how these territorial disputes influenced party politics. The Democratic Party, which had traditionally been a coalition of Northern and Southern interests, began to fracture under the strain of these debates. Meanwhile, new political movements like the Free Soil Party emerged, advocating against slavery's expansion into Western territories. In hindsight, it's clear that the Mexican-American War didn't just expand America's borders, it expanded its divisions. It forced Americans to confront fundamental questions about their nation's identity. Was it a country built on freedom and equality for all? Or was it a country willing to tolerate and even expand slavery for economic gain? By adding so much new territory without resolving these questions first, the Mexican-American War set America on an irreversible path toward conflict. It didn't cause the Civil War outright, but it created conditions that made compromise increasingly impossible. This moment serves as a reminder that expansion isn't always progress, and that sometimes gaining land can mean losing unity. The third pivotal moment on the road to the American Civil War was the period known as Bleeding Kansas. This violent and chaotic chapter in U.S. history revealed the depth of division over slavery and how far Americans were willing to go to defend their beliefs. What happened in Kansas wasn't just a territorial dispute, it was a preview of the Civil War itself, with neighbors turning against neighbors and blood being spilled over ideology. It all began with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which overturned the Missouri Compromise by allowing settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery through popular sovereignty. This policy gave settlers the power to vote on whether their territory would allow slavery. However, instead of creating a peaceful resolution, it turned Kansas into a battleground. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into the territory, each determined to sway the vote in their favor. The result was chaos and violence. Pro-slavery settlers, many from neighboring Missouri, formed armed militias and established their own government in Lecompton, declaring Kansas a slave state. Meanwhile, anti-slavery settlers created their own government in Topeka, rejecting slavery entirely. The presence of two rival governments claiming authority over the same territory created a recipe for disaster. Violence escalated quickly. Pro-slavery forces attacked anti-slavery settlements, burning homes and destroying property. In retaliation, abolitionist John Brown led a group of men in what became known as the Pottawatomie Massacre, where 5 pro-slavery settlers were brutally killed. This act shocked the nation and cemented Brown's reputation as both a hero to some and a terrorist to others. The conflict in Kansas wasn't just about local skirmishes, it became part of a larger national struggle. Newspapers across the country reported on the violence, fueling outrage on both sides. In Congress, debates over Kansas turned into physical altercations. One infamous incident involved pro-slavery Congressman Preston Brooks attacking abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner with a cane on the Senate floor after Sumner delivered an anti-slavery speech. The beating left Sumner severely injured and symbolized how deeply personal and bitter the conflict had become. The chaos in Kansas also exposed the failure of popular sovereignty as a solution to America's divisions. Instead of letting settlers peacefully decide the issue of slavery, it turned territories into battlegrounds where might made right. Both sides resorted to fraud and intimidation to influence elections. Pro-slavery forces stuffed ballot boxes and used violence to suppress anti-slavery voters, while anti-slavery settlers organized armed resistance. By 1856, Kansas had become so unstable that federal troops were sent in to restore order. Even with military intervention, tensions remained high. The violence foreshadowed what was coming on a national scale, a country so divided that compromise was no longer possible. Most importantly, Bleeding Kansas showed that Americans were no longer willing to settle their differences through debate or negotiation. They were ready to fight. The events in Kansas weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of escalating conflict that would eventually lead to war. In hindsight, Bleeding Kansas stands out as one of the clearest signs that America was heading toward civil war. It revealed how deeply entrenched sectionalism had become and how far both sides were willing to go to defend their vision for the country's future. For many historians, this period marks the true beginning of America's internal conflict, a time when ideological divisions turned into open violence. The lessons of Bleeding Kansas are clear. When compromise fails and dialogue breaks down, conflict becomes inevitable. What happened in Kansas wasn't just about slavery or statehood. It was about two fundamentally different visions for America's future colliding head-on. The fourth pivotal moment on the road to the American Civil War was the Supreme Court's infamous Dred Scott versus Sanford decision in 1857. This ruling didn't just deepen the divide between North and South, it obliterated decades of compromises that had sought to maintain peace. Far from being an isolated legal case, it became a devastating blow to unity and a critical step toward civil war. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom after living in free states and territories with his owner, Dr. John Emerson. Scott argued that his residence in free regions like Illinois and Wisconsin made him a free man. The case reached the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered one of the most controversial decisions in U.S. history. The court ruled against Scott in sweeping terms that went far beyond his individual case. First, it declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens of the United States and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. This alone was a monumental setback for Black Americans, stripping them of any legal standing and reinforcing their status as property rather than people. But Taney's ruling didn't stop there. The court also declared that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This meant that slavery could legally expand into any U.S. territory, regardless of whether it was north or south of the 36 degrees 30 minutes line established by the Compromise. This decision sent shockwaves through the nation. In the North, abolitionists were outraged, viewing the ruling as proof that pro-slavery forces had seized control of the federal government. Many Northerners who had previously been indifferent to slavery were galvanized into action, realizing that unchecked expansion could entrench slavery across the entire country. In contrast, Southerners celebrated the decision as a major victory. It validated their belief that slavery was a constitutional right and emboldened their efforts to expand it into new territories. However, even some moderate Southerners worried about the long-term consequences of such an extreme ruling, as it further alienated Northern states and made compromise increasingly unlikely. This moment serves as a stark reminder of how unchecked power can deepen divisions rather than resolve them. It showed that when institutions fail to uphold justice and equality, they risk tearing a nation apart, a lesson as relevant today as it was in 1857. The fifth and final pivotal moment on the road to the American Civil War was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859. This event wasn't just another episode of rising tensions between North and South. It was the spark that ignited widespread fear, distrust, and a sense of inevitability about the coming war. For Southerners, it confirmed their worst fears about abolitionists' willingness to use violence to destroy their way of life. For many Northerners, it cast Brown as a martyr for freedom. The raid's impact reverberated across the nation, making compromise all but impossible. John Brown was a radical abolitionist who believed slavery could only be ended through direct action. By 1859, he had already gained notoriety during Bleeding Kansas, where he led violent attacks against pro-slavery settlers. But Brown's ambitions extended far beyond Kansas. He envisioned a nationwide uprising of enslaved people that would overthrow slavery once and for all. To achieve this, Brown planned an audacious raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. His goal was to seize weapons from the arsenal and distribute them to enslaved people across the South, sparking a massive rebellion. On October 16, 1859, Brown and 21 followers launched their attack. They managed to capture the arsenal and take hostages, but their plan quickly unraveled when local militia surrounded them and cut off their escape routes. Within 2 days, U.S. Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee stormed the building, capturing Brown and his surviving followers. The raid itself was a military failure. Brown's hoped-for slave uprising never materialized, but its political and emotional impact was enormous. For Southerners, it was proof that Northern abolitionists were willing to use violence to destroy their society. The fact that Brown had received financial support from prominent Northern abolitionists only deepened Southern paranoia about a widespread conspiracy against slavery. In the North, reactions to Brown's raid were mixed. Some condemned his use of violence, arguing it undermined the abolitionist cause. Others saw him as a hero, a man willing to sacrifice everything for freedom. Ralph Waldo Emerson famously compared Brown's execution to Christ's crucifixion, declaring that he would make the gallows glorious like the cross. Brown's trial and execution only heightened tensions. During his trial, he delivered impassioned speeches defending his actions and condemning slavery as a moral evil. His words resonated with abolitionists across the North and turned him into a symbol of resistance against oppression. On December 2, 1859, Brown was hanged for treason in Charlestown, Virginia. His death sent shockwaves through both regions. Northerners mourned him as a martyr for justice, while Southerners saw his execution as necessary but feared more John Brown's might follow. The raid also escalated preparations for war in both regions. In the South, states began forming militias and stockpiling weapons in anticipation of further attacks from abolitionists or federal forces. And there you have it, the 5 explosive moments that paved the road to America's greatest internal conflict. But here's the question we're leaving you with. Was the Civil War truly inevitable, or could these moments have been diffused with stronger leadership, better compromises, or a different vision for America? Were these events the fault of deeply entrenched ideologies, or was it the failure of a nation to confront its own contradictions? History may have its answers, but what do you think? Was war the only path forward, or could America have avoided tearing itself apart? Let us know in the comments below, and let's keep this debate alive, because understanding our past is the only way to shape a better future.